This is Turkey, China, and Korea. So the green line is Korea. It goes up to 65% of the US, as you see, with a very fast convergence. China is converging now, but it is below Turkey, but is expected to grow, well, I don't, they have their own problems right now, so who knows what's going to happen. But they were expecting China to grow fast until the latest fight with Trump, so we'll see what happens. There are other countries that did miserably, actually. So this is a famous example. This is Argentina. So Argentina did the opposite. Instead of converging, it diverged. So it got much worse. It used to be a rich country. Now it's not a rich country. This makes economic growth theory very complicated, right? Some countries did converge, some countries did not converge, and everybody tries to understand why. Again, there are multiple reasons. I don't think I'm going to do a great summary of them. But there's one way of thinking about economic growth that I'm going to show you some data for, about how did they grow. So to answer that question, I'm going to give you some other data. So I'm going to look at GDP first, not GDP per capita, because there's really good data for this. And I'm going to do growth accounting. So I'm just going to say, we know there's a production function for the whole economy that produces this GDP. And the three major things that go into that production function are productivity, so total factor productivity, labor, and capital. All the others that I'm missing, there are many things, of course, you can put into that production function. They are going to show as TFP. So, for example, you could put land there, you could put natural resources there, you could make this a bit more complicated. But those are not going to be the main drivers. In the list of important factors, people now actually make a distinction between the type of capital and the type of labor that goes into this production function. So for the type of capital, I'm going to show you data on non-information and communications technology capital. So this could be all your construction, for example, would fit there. And ICT is information and communication technology capital. It gets its own category as being something more promising for the future growth rates because it hits this diminishing marginal productivity much later. So I'll show you data for that. For labor, people now differentiate between quality versus quantity because as you see, as population goes up, labor is going to go up, most likely, and that GDP will go up. But you can also increase GDP by increasing the quality of labor. So if your workers are actually more productive, you can capture that with their human capital. So in this data, if you start with the US, and I'm showing US not as a comparison. US is rich now. So US has reached that point where growth in the US is likely to come from different factors than growth in a country like Turkey. But nevertheless, it's useful to look at the US. So average growth of GDP in the US for this time period, 1990 to 2018, has been 2.7%. These things add up to that. Okay, these are the growths of total capital, labor quantity, labor quality, total factor productivity. These things add up to the average growth of GDP in this time period. So if I were to show that in a graph, this is what it looks like. You see that the largest contribution is coming from capital contribution. In here, non-ICT capital is larger than ICT capital, but they're all sort of contributing to GDP growth. Labor quality is here, labor quantity is here. So let me show you, let me compare countries in this dimension. So this is Turkish data. Again, it's 1990 to 2018. Average growth rate of GDP is 4.5. Again, that explains why we were able to converge in that time period, right? Our GDP growth is higher than the US, as it should be because we are a poor country. That's how we're supposed to be converging. So it's not so much of an accomplishment. That is how it should have been in the first place. We should have been growing faster than the U.S. And here you see the total contribution of capital is 3.2%, so about more than 70% of growth in GDP in this time period is due to capital accumulation. The sad part is that total factor productivity is contributing negatively. So there's really no role of productivity growth in this picture, and you actually can see it in this graph as well. This is comparing U.S. and Turkey. So U.S. is the same graph as before, but now the scale has changed. Red is Turkey, and total factor productivity is not contributing. Now, this is going to be important, especially later on when we talk about per capita GDP growth, and that's why I want to make sure that we are looking at total factor productivity and how it's been behaving. If you look at other countries, again, comparison with the U.S. may not be the best thing. So let's look at, I think I have, let's see which one is coming. Am I not pointing to the, okay, Korea and Turkey. So average GDP growth in Korea was 4.9% in this time period, same time period. So again, they have a lot of capital contribution of growth coming from capital, as Turkey does, but their total factor productivity actually is positively contributing to their economic growth. And if you want to look at China, even for China, even though small, their total factor productivity growth is positive compared to Turkey. So I would say this is one of the red warning signals for Turkey for future growth. This TFP thing, which measures productivity, which is a black box, but it's nevertheless looks at the contribution of growth that's coming from other than inputs like labor and capital. So anything that increases productivity of that labor and capital is going to be captured in TFP, and we are not doing so well in that dimension. Now, of course, at the end of the day, we don't care about GDP so much. We care about GDP per capita. So per person, are we better off over time? Income per capita or GDP per capita is what we're after. So if you were to write the production function for per capita GDP, then you're just going to get it as a function of TFP, then capital labor ratio. These are not going to show up separately anymore. They're going to show up as the ratio, and then human capital. So the solo growth model that sort of informs our thinking that's behind this growth accounting shows us that it's impossible to grow your per capita by just capital accumulation alone. That will hit diminishing returns. So we can't be just increasing our increasing labor by itself or population by itself is not going to do anything. If anything, it's going to lower the per capita GDP. So just population increasing is not going to be a solution to income per capita going up. If capital increases at the same rate as labor, then we are going to not contribute in that dimension to economic growth of per capita GDP. If capital is increasing faster than labor, then your capital labor ratio is going up, so you will have increases in per capita GDP, but that's going to hit diminishing returns, as like you can only have this many bridges and this many roads, and extra new bridge or road is not going to contribute to economic growth anymore. I don't know if we have hit it yet. We may not have. Our infrastructure is probably still in need of better roads and better infrastructure, but there will come a point where this won't help anymore. So what is left? How are we going to grow after that? There's really two things left. It's just the quality of labor and technology. So it's not a mystery. It's actually quite simple how you would grow. You need to make these things grow. But then it's a mystery of, well, it's not that much of a mystery actually, how to make human capital grow. You have to have good schools. You have to have good teachers. You have to pay them well. You have to make sure that they teach good stuff. That is going to be important for the future growth. They need to teach science and technology so that, say, TFP could also grow. So that part is not a mystery. It just needs to be done. And that might be the hard part. So we'll see how that grows or goes over time. But I'll show you one dimension where we are lacking. So for that technology part, I thought one indicator I can show you is R&D expenditures in a given country compared to other countries. So this is now OECD data. This is gross domestic spending on research and development in these countries. So this is Turkey. I always put red for Turkey. It's grown, but look at these numbers. This is 0.5%, this is 1%. We're talking about very small percentages of GDP. This is Spain. This is the OECD average. So about, around 2 to 2.5%. Where is some other countries? This is China. Okay, so I think we need to be there if we really want to have some chance in TFP picking up, because as we saw before, between the periods I showed you, 1990 to 2008, TFP was not doing that well. So we're low on R&D. And if I were to compare it with many countries, which this OECD data comes from, this is 2016. Turkey is here next to Argentina. I showed you Argentina per capita GDP. Not so good. So we need to make sure that we are far away from Argentina and closer to the left-hand side than to the right-hand side. So we are really low on that dimension. Even though there's been changes, it's still not enough. So next, I don't have data on, let me go back, on human capital, on labor quality. And I know there's plenty of people who work on these topics, and I would really like to hear about that, to see how Turkey is doing in that dimension. But that's the other part that will give us the possibility of long-run economic growth. Now, next I want to talk about how this capital accumulation is financed, but let me see how I'm doing with time. Okay. So this is also very simple. It can be financed two ways. Capital accumulation in the country can be financed either with domestic savings or with domestic and foreign savings. So how are we doing in that dimension? So before I show you Turkey, I want to show you a little bit about research that, as I said, I've been doing a lot of research on saving rates across different countries. So I want to show you a little bit about that before I show you graphs for Turkey. But there are huge differences in saving rates across countries and across time. So this is Japan. So my first paper was on the Japanese saving rate, and I think the paper was written in the 90s, and Japan had gone through this very high saving period, and then it actually is now down. And in this period, people used to say, oh, it's culture. Japanese are patient people. So all of a sudden, they became patient. It turns out that there are very logical reasons to why their saving rate was high then and low now. This is compared to, for example, I have I have US and China. So US was always low, and China is crazy high. Okay, so these are very different looking countries in terms of their saving rates. So I've written papers on all three, and culture hasn't been the explanation for it. I want to show you what it is for China, or what I think it is for China. So this paper I had with China, on China, focused on sort of like the role of the family in China and a bunch of social insurance, its existence or non-existence in China. So there used to be significant amount of family insurance in China. So kids took care of their parents, in other words, when they were sick. So this illnesses that might happen in the old age were an important part of this paper that we wrote. But what happened in China is that the one-child policy that the Chinese government imposed, starting especially after 80s, was a very sudden change, even though fertility rates might have gone down in China over time, like it did for many countries. This was imposed from the outset. And that made it very hard to provide family insurance, because when people had only one child, and when these two young adults get married, they had 4 elderly parents to take care of. So it became very hard to take care of family members who might fall ill by the kids. Meanwhile, social insurance in China, especially until recently, was very weak. There was no good social security, no good health insurance, no good insurance for these long-term care needs. So our story at the end was that those kind of concerns made people save a lot. They had to save a lot. Now, I just came from Singapore. It turns out there was no good social security system there still isn't. They're starting it in Singapore. So parents in Singapore brag about how much their kids pay them monthly as a stipend, because the kids are taking care of their parents. That never happens in the U.S. It's the opposite. Kids are giving to the kids because kids have no jobs. So the social insurance, the lack of it or the type of it, matters very much about who saves and who doesn't save. I suspect in Turkey, well, the saving rate is very low in Turkey, I'll show you. But I think there are going to be logical reasons to why it's low. So we had written a model, with my co-author Kai Zhao, who is Chinese. We actually modeled this family insurance. It's a household who decides on things. There are parents and children, and they face a bunch of risks. So kids face income risk, parents face healthcare risks. And we tried to do as good a job as we could to create a model economy that had these concerns that the Chinese people might have faced. And then we looked at what kind of a saving rate that model would generate. So we also put the Social Security, a lot of microdata we used to account for the makeup of the Chinese society at the time. And we got, I think this is the data, model and the data. So the red line is the saving rate in China in this time period, starting from 1970s. The blue line was the model-generated saving rate. So it really captured this giant increase after the 2000s, where the one-child families were hitting the... so one-child policy starts in 1980s. By 2000s, you have a lot of households where the adult child there's only one adult child, that they're 20 and above. And that one adult child is going to have a hard time taking care of the elderly parents. And these considerations in the model lead to this high saving rate. But is that you can do counterfactuals. So we said, okay, so suppose they did not have the one-child policy. What would have happened? Well, there would have been more family insurance. So we did that. And in this case, you get this green line, which is much lower than the blue line, basically, especially this increase. So some of the increase would have happened, but not as much. Then we said, what if they were all healthy? No long-term care needs. Or, in other words, this would be a case where you have enough health insurance that is provided in the society that the society will take care of you. If you do that, you get even a lower saving rate. So my point with this exercise, or showing it to you, is that even though that there may be lots of logical reasons to why saving rates differ very much across countries, that they don't have to be about culture, they don't have to be about we have become a consumer society or not. I think we need to first look deeply into the kind of insurance that is provided by the country to determine how much people individually need to save to look after their future. So, we also had predictions about the future for China, which is they're having higher social security benefits being introduced. So I never do forecasting. I never do say anything about the future. But in that paper, we said we expect their saving rates to go down. And I'm waiting to see what's going to happen. I think it has gone down some. As you can see, this is the gross savings. It's not exactly the same graph I had before, but it has gone down. And this is investment. The reason now I'm putting these things together is, I started with, how does capital accumulation happen? It happens with domestic savings or foreign savings, I said. The case in China is that domestic savings is greater than their domestic investment. So this difference in China is their current account surplus. And that this current account surplus has been shrinking because investment went up and savings went down. The opposite is true. So let me show you Turkey. This is now the same scale. I put them there together so that we see how low saving rates are in Turkey, obviously. Not only that, but investment is greater than savings in Turkey. So this red line is greater than the blue line. So this difference is the current account deficit of Turkey. So what is that deficit? That's what foreigners are sending to us to finance our investment. We can also be calling it, we are borrowing from the foreigners, right? That's like different phases of the current account deficit. And indeed, you see, this is China. This is the high surplus, current account surplus period of China. I mean, many papers were written in this period saying the world global imbalances are happening due to China, and they were. I mean, now their current account surplus actually is down to zero for the reasons I showed you. Both savings went down and investment went up. But who knows, investment may go down, which it seems like it might, so they might still, again, have current account surpluses. For Turkey, this was our deficit, very, very concerned. These are high numbers. They're like 9% of GDP. It has shrunk because of our economic troubles, actually, not for a good reason, but for a bad reason recently. But that's the reality of if you're investing more than you're saving, that's what you're doing. Foreigners are actually financing it. So with that, let me try to conclude. I want to go back to what I said about growth accounting, because that's really the thing that matters the most for the future. It's not so much the current account deficit or the surplus or any of that. If the economy grows fast, then all of these things will be taken care of. How it grows is important. So the big current account deficit, for example, makes the country very vulnerable to exchange rate risk. And we just saw, all of us, what exchange rate risk means for a country like Turkey. So I'm not trying to diminish the risks associated with that. But for long-run economic growth, not for those small fluctuations, what we need is these. And they are actually not hard stuff, but they're also very hard, it seems. So with that, I will finish. And I don't have to say. Come on.
Ayşe, there may be not Turkish speaking, or I guess more well prepared in your presentation in English. I you see, it's had a display after 2000. It's all appreciation of the Turkish lira. Being matter what you do, you cannot avoid the appreciation bias. And also taken away. And now we are going 1,000 nominal exchange rate. But the fact that observed this data, I said, well, of course, this is the advent of hyper observed with fragmented markers and all that. I in that we do. That's the economist made this very group economists. See, I have in Turkey, but it says that if you don't do anything else, then you attempt to do something with a negative total factor productivity growth. I explain this to my students and to myself as well, and I would like to hear your candid remarks on this issue.
Thank you, Erinch, my old classmate. Okay, so I'm not so sure about the dollar depreciation, Turkish lira exchange rate thing because of the... I'm sure it still has biases, but it's not as bad as the exchange rate itself. I mean, they measure prices in these countries when they're trying to figure out dispersing parity measures instead of converting things with dollars. I'm sure it's still not perfect, but Turkey has gone through crazy exchange rate fluctuations many times, and I can't imagine that the increase in GDP per capita since the 2000s can only be attributed to that. I think there has been real increases in GDP per capita in Turkey. You look around and you see it. But it may not be as large as what those graphs suggest. But that's numbers we should look at that carefully. In terms of total factor productivity, I totally agree with you. It's a black box. We don't know what it is. But it is not labor. It is not capital. And it is everything else that might increase productive capacity of a country, right? It can come from better management skills. It can come from better incentives given to workers. It can show up in many different ways. Now, as people, we actually do observe it. We used to go to a bank, and there would be no lines. We would all be huddled in front of the bank teller, and people would all be trying to reach the bank teller with no orderly behavior. Then they moved the lines. People actually learned to get in a line, and things, I think, progress much faster. I call it productivity. That would show up. I have the same worker there, I have the same bank teller, I have the same output, or the same capital, but output would be better because now it is much more orderly and it's happening with some progression. That would show up as TFP in the data. But it is a black box. I can't say I have confidence in productivity because I don't know what it is. But I know what it is not. I know we can't just keep building buildings and expect to grow. I know we can just populate the country and expect to grow. And what is left is going to be productivity and human capital. So in that sense, I put enough importance to it, even though I don't know exactly what it is. It's just there's many things all set up together. So I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer probably because there's nothing tangible that I can show you. But I think if we look around, we know how to observe whether or not an institution is productive or not. A university is productive or not. If it is
what is the case of Syrian refugees in Turkey? And I'm always asked what is their effect on the economy, and I point out that they are not skilled or educated people, very low-skilled people, and that's secondary for our economy, but may be different in the long run. I would like to ask your views on this first. And my second is also a comment, and the quality of education, the human capital, is going down and down in Turkey. And especially during the past 15 years, we have experienced a decline in scientific education and increase in religious education. And so I think the effect of this on future growth of Turkey is giving to me a very bleak picture. And I would like to ask your opinion on that also. Thank you.
Fine. No, thank you very much for those questions. Now, I have to warn you, I am an optimist. So everything I see is colored by how I think as an optimist. So, about the Syrian refugees, so I haven't done research on that. So, but the funny thing is, at USC, we have a faculty member who's from Colombia, who did a paper on Syrian refugees in Turkey. Figure that, you know. She had that idea first that she needed to find co-authors in Turkey so that she can have access to some data. She found them. So she has two Turkish co-authors, I think, on this project, and they got a lot of microdata on different parts of Turkey where refugees have settled. And they tried to estimate using definitive and some instruments, you know, not the kind of research I do. They tried to estimate the effects of Syrian refugees by looking at areas where they're more prominent compared to areas where they're less prominent. And they claim to have found a positive effect, actually, in terms of output in those regions. So they may be local human capital in some regions, but probably not everywhere. But even the local human capital ones might be opening a restaurant here, or I don't know exactly what kind of jobs that they're doing or what kind of little firms that they're opening. But according to her data, the areas where there was prominence of Syrian refugees have seen an increase in output. But that's only one paper. So, you know, I don't do research in that area, so I don't have too many papers I can cite, but I just happen to work with a Colombian woman who worked on that topic on Turkey. For the education system, I think that's where my optimism comes probably, but I don't know the data. I know the anecdotal evidence that Turkish education system is going down the drains, and that's very, very worrisome, and that will have huge impact for the future growth, for sure. You know, because I said human capital and TFP were the only two things really left. My optimism comes from something else. I think, so for example, in the US, it's a very strange education system in the US. Many people who go from Turkey to the US complain about the US education system. They say, oh, they don't learn math, they don't learn geography, they don't learn history. Well, it turns out that the good ones in the US are amazing. They know everything. They know everything. If you're a good student, you have a very good chance of knowing really well, or learning really well. And they take the country as the engines of the human capital. So some fraction, I don't know what fraction, of educated, really well-educated people are really important for future economic growth. I don't mean it to be for everyone. It doesn't have to be that 100% of the youth are really well-educated, or at least from my experience in the US. Average education or average student in the US is not really well versed in math or science. Not in religion either, but not in math or science either. But some fraction, some top students are amazingly good. And the optimist in me sees top students in schools like this who are amazingly good in Turkey, and many of them who come to the US. We have so many students, but they will go back. At some point, they will go back. When things get better, there will be a huge diaspora of Turkish students who are really well educated who will come back. My daughter came back 5 years ago to Turkey and lived for 5 years. Many of her friends from the US have come back. So the optimist in me says that there's enough numbers, because Turkey is a very large country, enough educated people who will pull off when the time is right. But I do wish that the general education was much better and was going down the rails.
Your slides, you talked about progressive growth in US and Turkey. You were comparing them, and there are some data about them. One indicator was labor quality and labor quantity. From 1980s till today, the labor quality was 0.4% in Turkey and 0.6% in US. And I'm confused because I was thinking labor quality and marginal productivity of labor was similar things. And because what I know, labor productivity increased much higher today. I think in 1990s, a work was done 10 hours by a worker was working, but today it's just 1 hour maybe. I mean, the increase must be higher. And my other questions, what your optimism about the current situation of savings in Turkey, about the current deficit is increasing and savings are lowering every day. What do you think about it?
Okay, so labor productivity might have been going up over time. The numbers I showed you were average from 1990 to 2008, just because I wanted to compare across countries. It is possible that that data is available publicly, and if you draw it, the labor contribution of labor quality might have gone up over time, and that's probably what you might be picking up with labor productivity. That is possible. But over that time period, the average numbers I was showing. Now, I'm sure I graphed them too, but I don't remember very well. If you could look at. And then your other question was saving rate being low in Turkey? Yes. So I had written a paper on the Turkish current account deficit, but the deficit was very high. And for that to only make sense economically would have been if Turkish households thought that their future income growth was high. If they expect future income growth to be high, then they would be saving very little today. Right? That's consistent with economic theory. But whether or not they are correct in their perception of the future of Turkey is, we don't know, right? But that would be the only way to rationalize the low saving rates today. I mean, in addition to the fact that social insurance exists in Turkey, unlike China or Singapore, healthcare has become better in Turkey compared to the past. Those would be reasons for lower saving rates. But to justify it fully, you would need some expectation on the household's part about the future income growth. And if they expected the growth that they have seen since the 2000s to continue like that into the future, then it rationalizes the behavior of the low savings. But if they're wrong, which they could be, then it's lower than optimal. And that's our current context.
Hello, thank you for the information talk. I'd like to ask about the automation. You know, the automation thing is going up in China and in the United States a lot, in Europe not that much, but still. automation. And in the United States, the reason why the product, in my opinion, the reason why in the United States and China and Korea productivity rates are high is because of the automated systems. How do you see this contribution of automation and productivity in German GDP?
That is a very good question. I don't think my answer will be a scientific one. It is really just based on the papers I've been listening to, because it is a very hot topic. Lots of people are giving papers on AI and what that means for the future. Some people say, look, this is similar to what happened in the past. So, for example, agriculture was a very labor-intensive sector, and then it became automated. So the number of people worked in fields went down dramatically, and machines started doing it. So some people think that this may not be very different than what happened in the past. But I think more people are more concerned than this view of saying, it's not terribly different from the past. The people who are concerned, again, the optimist in me says, okay, it's great that the machines do the work, we can all enjoy life. But I don't think the world is going to be as positive. The kind of jobs that are going to be lost to automation are these routine jobs that are actually possible to automate. And some of those routine jobs are horrible jobs. Instead of having a person go into a mine, if you had robots go into a mine to mine the mine, that would be a better world, I think. I think there are some very positive aspects of AI, and we're yet to see how it's going to work out. So my ideas are very speculative, but I think humans are pretty amazing. They do find ways to deal with it. So the optimist in me is not worried about AI. But again, I hope for her. So there are two types of entrepreneurs. Even in the US data, there are, so for example, a dry cleaner is also an entrepreneur, and somebody who's inventing technology is an entrepreneur. Of course, good entrepreneurship is very important for future productivity, but I think how you do it is very important. Suppose the property rights in the country are very bad, and the courts are very bad, so your entrepreneur, if he gets in trouble, he doesn't know how he is going to be resolved. Then even if you give subsidies for people to become entrepreneurs, it's not going to be a very good connection. So I think the basic stuff has to be cleaned out, then the rest will come. So how you do it is very important. I think that's why all these growth theory people, what they focus on is you have to have a good laws, you have to have good property rights, the courts need to work. They don't say subsidize entrepreneurship. I mean, you can do that too, obviously, but if these things are not working, if it is really hard to open a business, if the paperwork is so bureaucratic, like in India, that takes 8 months to open a new business, then even if you subsidize entrepreneurs, you're not going to get very good results. So the place where you have to make the biggest change, I think, in my humble opinion, is in the root of the problems, which is the basic stuff. The property rights, the courts, democracy. Darullah General talks about that all the time, where people feel like their efforts are going to be rewarded in a just way, and that whoever is the better productive firm is going to win the contracts. Then you see entrepreneurship flourish. So of course it's a very important component of productivity, but how it is done is the tricky thing. And there, I think, many challenges lie.
size göstereyim. Çok enteresan, hoşunuza gidecektir. Sonra biz de fuayeye geçiyoruz. A binasına geçiyoruz. Orada çay arası var. Daha sonra program devam ediyor.
etmiştir şimdilik ama vardır ve bölüm onun örgütlenmiştir. Evet, bunu söylemek istedim.
Çay molası için bizim binaya